There's a little blue light on. Testing. There you go. All right. We good? Do I need to clap to start the thing? Does that work? All right. All right, good evening. I am happy to be back with you again and get to talk to you about one of my favorite topics tonight. We're going to talk about Nero. But before we get that, I want to finish up a couple of things that I had to rush through last night or didn't quite get to last night. First, if you are taking this for credit online or in the future, there is a test that you all have to take, and you will have to email it back to me. So I'll need your email address in order to get that test to you. I'm going to have a slide in a little bit that'll have all my contact information on there, so you can text me, you can email me, however you want to get in touch with me. And then I want to finish up with what counts. From last night, we talked about what all is included, what all do we count as biblical coins. So we count coins mentioned in the Bible, that goes without even mentioning, right? Because that's obvious. Then coins from geographic regions connected to the Bible lands and all of the different peoples, the Romans, the Persians, and all the other civilizations around there. Coins of people mentioned in the Bible, and we looked at several of those. Certainly all the emperors, but also some of the more minor characters, including all the Herods. And we looked at animals, plants, buildings, modes of transportation, all those sorts of things. I forgot to mention this last night, I know somebody who collects hairstyles on the back of, on coins. He only collects coins of women and all of their different hairstyles because they had some pretty crazy hairstyles back then. So that's what he likes. And then events. We looked at those, including Judea Capta coins and Roman triumphs. And then the one I didn't get to is you can also include Christian history, particularly early Christian history, in collecting money of the Bible. As you start to get out of the 300s and 400s, you get further and further away from what really would count as money of the Bible. But up to about Constantine the First, Constantine the Great, he is the Roman emperor who converted to Christianity, and then he turned the Roman Empire towards Christianity, and he kind of founded what became the Catholic Church eventually. And he tried to standardize things, and he tried to convert pagan rituals into Christian rituals, and that's how we got a lot of the so-called holy sites, how we got a lot of the holidays. They're connected, particularly Christmas is connected to Saturnalia, and Easter is, I know this is going to be shocking to you, it's a fertility festival in the spring. That's why you have eggs and rabbits, which have nothing to do with the resurrection, but have a lot to do with fertility. So that's why it's tied to a fertility festival. And he tried to make it so that pagans would more easily go into what he considered to be Christianity to help him better control the empire. We didn't get to talk about what all they were worth either. And of course, you can stand up here and you can say, these are 20 silver coins to 1 gold coin and things of that nature. But when it comes right down to it, coins are worth whatever you can buy with them. And there are some lists that include what you can buy with the coins from different resources. Most of these come out of this book, Roman Palestine, 200 to 400, Money and Prices. But they're first century prices, even though he says it's 200 to 400, he does include some first century prices. It includes wages of Rabbi Hillel, which was his daily wage was half a denarii. So he was getting half of what a soldier would get. I think it was stating that to try to make him seem humble and living on a poor salary. A vineyard worker, he got that from the Bible, but the salary was about a denarius for a day. Looking after a sick man, I know he got that from the Bible as well. 2 denarii a day or more, because the Good Samaritan says he'll bring more money if he needs to. And weaving a talit was 8 denarii. A good scribe could earn 12 denarii a week, and the food cost him 4, and clothing would cost him 4. So he was netting about 4 denarii a week he could put into savings and save up. Food, 1 sarach of wheat, which is about 7.3 liters or 2 gallons of wheat. That's 2 or 3 denarii. 1 to 1 1/3 sarah of flour is 1 denarii. 1 loaf of bread is 1/12 of a denarius. 1 amphora of olive oil is 1 denarius. 10 figs, 1 pomegranate, or 1 cluster of grapes was 1/24 of a denarius. And an ox, if you're trying to buy some cattle or some kind of livestock for your farm, an ox is going to cost you 100 to 200 denarii. A calf for 20. A newborn donkey would be 2 to 4 denarius. And a ram was 8 denarii. And of course, you could get 2 sparrows for 1/16 of a denarius, or 5 sparrows for 1/8, so you get 1 for free. And rent of a courtyard was 40 denarii a year, and rent of a house was 48 denarius. So you're getting a courtyard, which is where a lot of the business of your day is going to be taking place, because you're going to want to be outside and not in. But I do think it's important to kind of get a sense of how much things were costing people and how hard it was to get ahead, just like today, same exact problem. All right, there's my contact information that I promised you. It's luke@housetohouse.com. My phone number is 256-614-2367. You can text me. You can't text me late at night, because you're not going to be able to wake me up, because I put it on silent. It automatically switches over at night, so nobody can bug me past 10 o'clock, but you're welcome to text me or call me if you need me. And there's my mailing address, should you need that. I had 2 people ask me for that on Facebook last night, so there it is if you need it. And then we're going to talk tonight about bad Roman history. One of my favorite topics. I really enjoy this topic. So, in the short, if we were just going to take 5 minutes to do this class, Roman history is bad. It's like really, 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 really bad. It's ridiculously bad. If the point of history is to learn what happened, how it happened, what people were doing, why they did what they did, if that's the point, to learn what really happened, then Roman history would be classified as just really, really bad. That was not how they told history. It wasn't even expected to be that way. History. In other words, what did I learn from doing all of this research, all of this writing in history? I recommend reading the short book. The rest of the books, they're pretty long and boring. But that short book on the lessons of history, one of the things he points out in that, which I think it was really eye-opening to me, and it really helped me see things in a different light. He says that it's really easy for people to understand 100 years. Like, that's an easy concept to grasp, because we can live to be 100. Most people don't live to be 100, but you hope to live to be in your 90s, right? And we can easily grasp 100 years. We get that period of time. He says, and then the human brain is pretty good at doubling that. So since we know how long 100 years is, it's not too hard for us to double that and say, okay, I have a good concept of 200 years. He says, after that, I think he phrased it, all bets are off. He says, after 200 years, people start to get fuzzy, and things just start to kind of meld together. And then you start throwing around terms like 2,000 years ago and 2,500 years ago, and it's all in our brain just as like long time ago. They don't really get it. And I think part of his point in that, he said, look, people's values after 200 years, if you're 200 years past your, like we are well past 200 years now, the founding of America, you're going to start to lose your values from that time period because it's hard for people to grasp things from more than 200 years ago. It's hard for us to say, okay, well, what was 500 years ago? What was 700 years ago? Are you in the Middle Ages? Are you in the Dark Age? Where are you 700 years ago? To us, it's very similar to 2,000 years ago or 2,500 years ago. And so we look at Abraham or Noah, it's hard for us to grasp how far apart and how different that is. And then you think about the intertestamental period. There's 400 years of silence, twice the time period that it takes for values to get sort of fuzzy. So the closing of the Old Testament to the opening of the New Testament is 400 years. That's a long time for the voice of God through the prophets to be silenced, right? There's no miracles, there's no new information happening. And then all of a sudden, John comes on the scene, and then Jesus, and there's miracles, and there's fulfilled prophecy. There's all sorts of things happening again, and then there's inspiration again for the first century. And that was a big change. That was eye-opening to people. And it was this big awakening happening, and it's part of what helped the church to spread so quickly. And the Roman Empire itself helped the church to spread so quickly, but because it provided stability and peace, roads and transportation, safety, and relative freedom under some of these emperors. So then you take a look at some of these books that are not the Bible. Some of these ancient texts, things like the Iliad and the Odyssey, right? So the Iliad and the Odyssey is the most famous Greek work, and nobody questions its authenticity, nobody attacks it, right? It was written about 900 BC, so 2,900 years ago, right? And the earliest available manuscript is from 400 BC, 500 years after it was written. And total manuscripts, there are only 643. That's the best attested ancient book besides the Bible. 643 manuscripts. The works of Plato, which were written around 427 to 347 BC, the earliest available manuscripts are from AD 900. All right? So that's 1,200 years after they were written. And there is one fragment from the 3rd century BC, and that's it. And there are only a total of 7 manuscripts of Plato. And yet nobody is questioning the works of Plato, right? And then you get the works of Aristotle, 1,400 years separating the earliest available manuscript and when it was written. Total manuscripts 49. The works of Julius Caesar, earliest manuscript is 1,000 years after it was written. Total manuscripts 10. The New Testament was written in the 1st century. The earliest manuscript fragments are from the 1st century, 2nd century, and total manuscripts are over 5,800. So keep that in mind. And the works of Pliny are on there as well. Our earliest available manuscript, 750 years after it was written. Total manuscripts, 7. So people all the time attack the Bible, and yet they let all these other works pass that are there in fragments that are 1,000 years separated from when they were originally written, that are sometimes only available in summaries. The evidence for the New Testament is so overwhelmingly better, much better, than all other works of antiquity. It's absolutely ridiculous. And as you start to look at Roman history, which we're going to do in depth over the next few minutes. Over the next 30 minutes, we're going to look at, what are the best sources of Roman history. And we're going to start pulling things from coins to fill in gaps in that Roman history. We are so spoiled as Christians with the Bible because the Bible is fantastic history. We're just used to having really good history. And we're kind of used to people attacking it because they're all the time trying to attack the Bible, pick the Bible apart, claim that there are contradictions in the Bible. If you ever are confronted with that, I really want to recommend a 3-volume set by Eric Lyons called The Anvil Rings. It's a fantastic set. He just finished the 3rd volume and they released it as a box set. It's fantastic. He looks at all of these alleged contradictions in the Bible, all these things that people say about the Bible to try to attack it, and he answers them one by one. And it's an absolutely wonderful and brilliant work. And I appreciate all the work that's done at Apologetics Press. But the Bible is so much better than Roman history. You may have followed this. One good thing about being the coin guy and known as the coin guy is that anytime something happens in the world of ancient coins, somebody's going to text me and tell me about it. I mean, I'm going to get texts that tell me. And Alan Webster was texting me about the Roman Emperor Spontian or Spontianus. They don't really know. And for the longest time, they didn't think this guy really existed because they had this coin and a couple of other coins, but they had declared that they were fakes. Just recently, somebody took another look at it, put it up under an electron microscope, looked at it through X-ray spectrometry, and it turns out not a fake. This is a real ancient Roman coin of this emperor that they had written off as not even a real person. Now there's debate as to whether he's an emperor or not. One thing's for certain, that this is a real coin, which there's now saying it is because it has evidence that it was buried for centuries. It has the minerals that get absorbed into the metal. So it's certainly, almost a 2,000-year-old coin. Certain that he declared himself an emperor because it says right here, IMP. He's declaring himself an emperor at the very least. But they forgot an entire emperor, okay, from history until just a couple of weeks ago when they made this announcement about these coins. So there's no doubt that Roman history has all types of gaps and problems in it. And a lot of what we know about Roman history is just not true. And I'm going to try to show that tonight as we go in depth into talking about Nero. But I want to talk first about all the Roman emperors that are there as the Bible is being written. Certainly Caesar Augustus and Tiberius are the 2 emperors that the Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, which is the life of Jesus, those are the only 2 emperors during that time period. Now, they were written under a different emperor, but they're referring back to the time period of Caesar Augustus and Tiberius. And then during the time of Caligula, there's nothing that's really written. He only was around for 4 years. We're going to talk about him tonight, but there's no books being written other than a portion of the book of Acts covers those same years. Acts covers the years of Tiberius up through Nero. At the end of Acts, Nero is still the emperor. And then 1st and 2nd Thessalonians and James are written during the time of Claudius. And then all of these other books, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Galatians, Romans, Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, Philemon, Titus, 1st, 2nd Peter, maybe Hebrews and Jude, are all written during Nero's reign. And Nero was around for a while. All right. What I wanted to note is that from these emperors, you have 1 mention of Augustus, you have 2 mentions of Tiberius, only once by name, 2 mentions of Claudius, We went over those yesterday, the famine and when he expelled the Jews out of Rome. And two mentions of Nero, never by name. The most famous one is Philippians 4:22, where he references Christians inside the household of Caesar. That Caesar is Nero, and that's Nero's household had Christians in it, and we talked about that briefly last night. That's all the times that the ruler of that world are mentioned in the New Testament. Now, the point I want to make there is that these were absolute rulers, and there was little you could do to change your ruler. You couldn't vote them in or out. You're just kind of at the whim of what happens throughout this empire. But that affected a lot of stuff, right? I mean, they controlled whether you had freedom of speech, freedom of religion, whether you could move about freely, whether you were arrested for being a Christian, whether you were tortured, whether you were killed. They affected a lot of things, and they're only mentioned 7 times. Now, I'll be honest, I go to church on Sunday, and Trump and Biden get mentioned more than the emperors are mentioned in the entire New Testament. I think we could probably take a lesson from that, and that we shouldn't necessarily worry so much about politics as we should worry about the mission of Christianity. And I'm not saying we shouldn't vote. I think we should vote. I think we should vote our conscience, and I think all of that's very true. But I think that we can get in trouble quickly and get very divisive, and we can be very off-putting to people when we dig into too many politics and quit worrying about the message of the Bible. They were concerned about the message in the New Testament. Even when they were being put in prison for it, they're still singing praises to God, teaching the jailer. They're still doing God's work, and that's what we've got to focus on and keep in mind. All right, that's my soapbox for all of that. Now we're going to talk about Roman history. We're going to start with something familiar. You recognize that slide. I assume you've heard of George Washington and the cherry tree, right? That real history? Is that a real thing that happened? I mean, no. George Washington didn't cut down a cherry tree. He didn't have the little George Washington face when he was a little kid either. But I like that picture because it illustrates the point. Why is that a story that all of us have heard? Why is it something that we teach children and have taught children in school? Well, it's poetic truth. It teaches a moral, right? We're putting the idea that George Washington was an honest person, which I'm not sure how this really communicates that story. He did chop down a cherry tree, which is just weird. But, I mean, that's a lot of work to go about. If I'm going to do something bad, I'm not going to chop down a cherry tree. I'm just going to go out there on a limb and say that. But he did. He chopped it down, and I cannot tell a lie. It was I that chopped down the cherry tree, right? And the whole point is to teach children, well, even when we do something bad, we should be honest and come clean, just like George Washington would have, right? He was an honest person. And we have similar stories about Honest Abe, right? The rail splitter, Abraham Lincoln. And these are poetic truths. And the reason I say that the same is true of Paul Revere's ride, right? There were more than just Paul Revere. There was a girl who rode, I think, twice as long as Paul Revere did, but she doesn't get mentioned, and I can't even remember her name. So this poetic truth has a purpose. It teaches morals and those sorts of things. But in Roman history, that's what was expected from a Roman historian. So rather than collecting facts and evidence and using them to report what happened and why it happened, Roman history was expected to be poetic with a moral. And speeches, plans, thoughts were often invented, even encouraged to be invented by the historian in order to make his point. It's again, poetic truth. It was considered a work of art. They may, for instance, say what a person was thinking. And we're going to see some of that tonight as we look at Agrippina and the history around Nero's mother. They'll say what she was thinking. Well, how do they know what she was thinking? They didn't interview her, right? They are reporting things 40 years after she had died. They don't know what she was thinking. There's one point where she's alone in the palace, and there's an entire speech given by her to nobody. Well, how did they write that speech down? How do they know what she said, right? It's completely made up history to prove a point. In this case, it was to prove that Agrippina was overstepping her bounds as a woman and needed to stay in her place. That's what the point that the historian's trying to make. So I say all of that to say we have to be careful as we read ancient history outside of the Bible and just assuming that everything that they're saying is true. Another purpose of Roman history was to sell books. And I don't know if you know this, but gossip and really crude kind of stories, they sell books, right? If you've got a juicy bit of gossip that you can put out, hey, this book contains this piece of gossip, right? You should see what else is in that book, right? So that there's incentive for them to elaborate on the story, in other words. All right. So we are spoiled in the church because the Bible reports actual history, and we should not take too serious some of the history that's out there outside of the Bible. Now, another thing that we need to keep in mind is that some of these historians were writing in an environment that was not safe. They had motivations to, well, if you were writing under Caligula and you were writing a history of Roman emperors, it would be wise of you to say bad things about his enemies, and it would be unwise of you to say any bad things about him. There was a playwright who wrote into one of his plays a joke about Caligula, and he had him drug into the square and burned at the stake because he didn't like what he wrote about him in that play. All right. So with Nero, as he's my case study. He's who I want to look at tonight. He's one of my favorite emperors. I really enjoy studying about Nero, and having studied about him for many years and read many, many biographies of him, of his mother, of others in his family, and everything from the original historians. You could read almost all of it in a day, maybe 2 days, from the original historians. I've studied it and I've thought about Nero a long time, and where I'm at on him now, I actually feel sorry for him. I feel like he had a really difficult time where he was put into some very strange psychological situations where he eventually did not handle those very well. Certainly, I feel sorry for him. I know that he did persecute Christians, and we're going to talk about that. But at the same time, I pity him because of the difficulty that he had to face. But I want to put it into terms that we can understand, so that we can understand where the history about Nero and what you've heard about Nero may not all be true. Almost certainly is not all true. I want you to think about Donald Trump. Now, I don't care what you think about Donald Trump, but everybody's heard of Donald Trump because he's all over the news all the time, right? So I want you to imagine that 40 years from now, somebody is going to write the first history of Donald Trump. Nobody's written any history. We don't have any record of any history of Donald Trump for 40 years. So somebody's going to write about it 40 years from now, and then the only sources that they can use are going to be news footage of newscasters talking about Trump and Facebook. And that's all the sources they're going to be able to use. Now, also imagine that the person writing it is a Democrat. And that they are allowed and even encouraged to change his speeches to fit their narrative, and even encouraged to say what people were thinking, what he was thinking when he was doing things, without interviewing him or interviewing anybody around him. There are a couple of partial copies left. What kind of picture would you have of Donald Trump? What would you think of him? Well, you probably think he was a monster, right? You think he is a horrible person who set out to destroy the republic or whatever. That's the case with Nero. We have no history of him for 40 years after his reign. And the person writing about him hated his guts. This guy, Tacitus, did not like Nero. All right, and he doesn't like anybody connected with Nero. He really doesn't like his mother. And on top of that, Nero was the last in the Julio-Claudian line. So it doesn't behoove you to write nice things about the previous family of emperors when you're now under the new set of emperors, right? You don't want to say nice things about the guy that they replaced. That's the case with Tacitus. Tacitus is by far the most important source we have on the reign of Nero. And he had just survived Domitian's reign of terror. And to do so, he had to compromise his morals. He had to be a bad person in order to survive under that emperor's reign. And he's kind of writing this history of the emperors as a way to purge his soul for his guilt about what had happened under Domitian. So he's kind of just writing all the bad things about all the emperors that he could think of, that he could find, any rumors that he hears, any kind of speeches that he can make up to try to say bad things about him. And all of the sources that he cites, all of them are now lost. We no longer have the works of Pliny the Elder, Flavius Rufus, Fabius Rusticus, Bassus. Agrippina Jr. actually wrote an autobiography, and we don't have that either. But he had all of those sources to work off of, but we don't have any way to corroborate any of his information. He also implies, in a lot of cases, that things may have happened, but I don't really know. In other words, he likes to report on rumor and speculation, any kind of junky kind of gossip that sells books. For his annals, only the portion up to 70 AD exists, which does complete Nero, and it's only extant in 2 incomplete manuscripts. Both of them are from the Middle Ages. So one is in Germany from about 850 AD, so hundreds of years, so over 700 years, 800 years since it had been written. It contains books 1 through 6. And an 11th century copy has books 11 through 16. So the missing parts cover all of Caligula, so we don't have his work on Caligula, the early years of Claudius, and it's also missing the last few chapters. So Nero, we miss all of Nero's birth and his early years, as well as the last 2 years of his life. Take that into account that he also hated Nero, and he hated pretty much all emperors, but he had to write nice things about the current emperor. And he was purging his soul from this lack of morals during Domitian. And keep in mind, that's the best history we have written about Nero. That's the best account of his life that we have. Then Suetonius is weird. So Suetonius doesn't write normal things. He likes to write about fashion and parties and gossip. He leaves out tremendously important things and records a bunch of palace gossip type of things. Most of his work is lost. He was a librarian, so I hate to say bad things about him because I'm a librarian, but he was a librarian under Hadrian, so he had attically instead of chronologically. making it. So when you read it, it's a really strange read about Nero. You're reading about Nero, and he groups, there's a section about parties, there's a section about the way he dressed, and you just can't tell when anything's happening because it's not chronological, it's all thematic. And that's the second best history we have. And then Dio Cassius, or Cassius Dio, we don't know which way his name was read. He wrote 100 years after Suetonius. He wrote an 80-book history of Rome. The part about Nero only survives in an 11th century manuscript that's a summary of the work. So there are no copies of Dio Cassius's original work on Nero, only an 11th century summary of it. And then Josephus, Josephus has pretty good history, but he only mentions Nero in passing a few times when it's connected, because he's writing a history of the Jews. So as he's connected to the Jews in a couple of points, he writes about Nero, but nothing significant about his life. That's it. That's all the primary resources that we have on Nero. So what do we do? If we want to learn really about Nero, where are we going to turn? Well, we're going to turn to archaeology and to coins. We're going to look at coins and see, what did Nero say about himself? And what did others say about him and his family using coins? How did that go? In other words, what did he want other people to know about himself at different times? And it's really interesting because Nero wanted there to be Greek culture pulled into Roman life. He was very much about art and music and theater. He wanted all of these things, all these Greek ideas and philosophies. He wanted to pull those into Roman culture. He was really the leader in a culture war. You had the old guard, these guys who were maintaining conservative Roman values and the idea of conquering nations. And they're saying, look, we conquered the Greeks. Why do we want to emulate them? Why do we want to follow their art and their theater and their music? We don't care, And Nero was saying, no, I want to be more like the Greeks. We should love art and culture and music and all of these things. And you see it reflected on his coinage. He has the nicest coins out of any other Roman emperor ever. Like, he put real work into his coins. You can tell that he personally was involved in the making of his coins. A lot of them are like works of art. And I think it's interesting too, because you see him grow up on his coins. You see early pictures of him when he's even a little boy. And you see him when he's younger and an athlete. He's athletic. He was an actor and an athlete. And you also see him struggling with his weight. So towards the end, he had a lot of trouble with his weight. But he depicts himself fairly truthfully on all of these coins. And so I find that really interesting about him. And I think that you can tell a lot from the history that's coming out on the coinage of him and his family. This is a Julio-Claudian family tree. It is not quite as bad as the family tree of, say, the Herods, but there is a little intermixing and intermingling going on here. It was all about power. So the people you're married to, you want to marry up, or you want to marry at least sideways, right? So if you're the top family, it's going to be tough. If you marry outside of the family, then you're bringing in others into the Julio-Claudian line. So a lot of times they're going to intermarry. It's all political and money. To understand Nero, you really have to understand the family and how family was regarded in ancient Rome. Romans would have a room in their house dedicated to their ancestors and to essentially ancestor worship. They would have death masks made of people that would hang in these rooms. And whenever somebody in the family died, they were Romans. And the family doing the right thing at the funeral, very, very important. If you didn't do the right thing, then you were going to be haunted, by the family member who died. And we're going to see that come into play a little bit in Agrippina's life, Nero's mom. And I want to make it as brief as I can, but I want you to understand the environment that Nero grew up in and what was expected of him and the pressure that was applied to him, and how it could cause somebody to really break. And also, they're constantly telling him that he's essentially a god. They're constantly referring to him as that way, as the son of a god, because his ancestors were deified. And over time, if enough people tell you how great you are, you start thinking, maybe I am great, right? Preachers can have this problem too. Not thinking they're a god, but preachers, if at the end you go to the back and everybody tells you what a great job you did and shakes your hand, and eventually you just think, well, I really am great. Everybody says I'm great all the time. I must be great, right? Well, Nero had that all the time from everybody because he had power of life and death over them, and he could raise them up. And then we'll be back to continue on, starting on Agrippina. So, thanks. Ready? That's the international sign of, I mean, they told me I have to clap to sync all the cameras or something. I don't know. I think they're just trying to make me look silly. Is this on? Is it? Yeah, okay. All right, good deal. Back at it. We are going to talk about Agrippina. So we're up to talking about Nero's family. And as I said, I think to understand Nero, you really have to understand the family background. You have to understand where his mother came from and what she had to deal with. Nero's grandmother, who was Agrippina Senior, who knew a thing or two about politics as well. Her mother, Agrippina Senior, Agrippina the Elder, the Romans, I don't know where they picked this up, but they name everybody the same thing. It's just like the Herods. Talking about the Herods is a nightmare because everybody's Herod, even the girls are named Herod. Well, it's the same thing there. Her father, Agrippa, named her Agrippina. So there you go. But eventually he becomes Germanicus, and he gets that name from conquering Germany. So makes sense. He was extremely popular, and there's a lot of debate about whether he was actually a good general or not. But whether or not he was a good general, the people loved him because he conquered new territory for Rome, and he was sort of in line to become the emperor, but he dies. So bad news for everybody, right? So when he dies, this is Nero's grandfather, Germanicus. There's a huge spectacle. Agrippina the Elder, Agrippina Senior, makes a huge deal out of this death. And she hires, you can actually see it's the same thing for her. This is her memoria cart, but she makes one of these for him. It's very elaborate. She puts the body in there, and she takes it on tour, heading back from where he had died to Rome. Very similar to when Abraham Lincoln died, they did a death train for him because he was beloved throughout the country, right? And his death was very sudden at a time in our country where we had just gotten through such a horrible period of history, and it looks like we were coming out of that, and then he's assassinated. All right, the train for Lincoln, everywhere it went, people just thronged to the train to say their goodbyes to that great man. The same thing here. Everywhere they went, they're in mourning. And Agrippina Jr., who was only, I think she was 6 or 7 at the time, but she remembered it. This is a big deal to her. Her impression is going to be, look, my father was super important, and my mother is super important, and all of Rome loves us because we are related to on the Julio-Claudian line, eventually Julius Caesar. So we're important, and everybody loves us. That's the main message that they're going to have. And that gets imprinted on Agrippina Jr.'s brain. She remembers this spectacle that her mother made. She remembers how much people loved her. So she does this mourning tour, and all of Rome comes out to see it. This is not lost on Tiberius, who is now the emperor, right? Everybody loved Germanicus. They were looking forward to when he would be emperor. And now we're stuck with Tiberius, who's not that great. He hasn't conquered anything. He's not that great of a leader. He's kind of a nasty, bitter, angry person. And he's generally just not a very nice guy. He gets in a feud with Agrippina Senior. And when you get in a feud with the emperor, eventually, even if you're related to Julius Caesar, eventually things are going to go badly for you. They go very badly for Agrippina Sr. He exiles her to an island where the history is pretty fuzzy. We don't know exactly what happens to her. She is treated really badly, and she either starves herself to death, like goes through a hunger strike until she dies, or is starved to death. Either way, she dies a horrible, slow death, being tortured and imprisoned very far away from Rome, and never gets to see her family again. So Agrippina Jr.'s mother is ripped away, sent off to exile, and Agrippina Jr. is left with her brothers and sisters. Tiberius doesn't like them very much either. Eventually, after he exiles Agrippina Sr. and she dies, two of her brothers, Drusus and Nero, not the Nero we're studying, Nero, her brother, are both killed by Tiberius. All of this by the time that Agrippina Jr. is 16 years old. So Agrippina is 16. She's lost her father, her mother, two brothers, and she really has to fear for her life as well. If Tiberius is going to kill her brothers, he might kill her. Her brother Caligula is going to kill him. And Caligula knows this. That's the kind of pressure that he's under. During all of this time, Caligula tries to stay in line so that he doesn't get in trouble with Tiberius. Eventually, Tiberius dies. And amazingly, Caligula, who is the best candidate in the Julio-Claudian line, ascends to the throne. Now, you probably know some things about Caligula too, but he's not necessarily as bad as you may have heard. But we're going to talk about that as well. During this time, after Caligula ascends to the throne, and that's him there, Agrippina Jr. gets married to Nasus, Domitius, and Aenobarbus. We don't know much about him other than he was much older and he's mean. The only stories we know about him are where he's mean to somebody. So, for instance, he runs over a slave in the road and doesn't stop to see if he's all right, doesn't care, says some nasty things about him. Those types of things. That's the only stuff we really know about Aenobarbus, but that turns out to be Nero's father. Now, Caligula, and I want you to think about the psychology of this. His mother and father have died. His brothers have been killed. His mother was sent away into exile. And he had to live with Tiberius in constant fear for his life. He could never step out of line. He had to serve him and bow down to him, and all this time to the person who had killed his mother and brothers. And now he's in charge all of a sudden. If you were on the side of Tiberius during any of that time, you were not in favor with Caligula, right? So he immediately starts cleaning house. He kills or exiles all of those people as he takes charge. And the other thing you need to know about Caligula is he really, really loved his sisters. Now, there's even some, stories and that kind of thing about incest and that kind of thing. I think most of that is made up. It's pretty much anytime some historian wants to say some bad thing about an emperor or a person, he's going to claim those things. But there's no question that he absolutely loved his sisters. And we see it in several different ways, and especially Drusilla. So Agrippina Jr. is his sister, and Livia, sometimes Julia, so Agrippina, Drusilla, and Julia. And those are his sisters. He puts them on coins. And then they all go back to the island where Agrippina Sr. died, and they get her body, and they make a funeral wagon for her, and they do the exact same route that they did with Germanicus, and the same thing happens. So when Agrippina Senior had done that with Germanicus and did that tour, and everybody loved Germanicus, they remembered that, and they did the same thing for Agrippina Senior, and people were so relieved to be past Tiberius and so relieved that they were honoring Agrippina again. The same thing happens. Everybody just loves them. And he adds them to a coin. He also interns Agrippina Senior in the mausoleum of Augustus. And then he adds the sisters to the oath that everyone has to take to the emperor. And the oath was, I will not hold myself or my children dearer than I hold the emperor Gaius and his sisters. So Caligula, which is what we know him by, that was a nickname. It meant little boots. He no doubt didn't like that too much. Gaius was his actual name. And that was the oath that they had to take. And you think about that in Luke 14:26, where Jesus says, anyone who wants to follow me, wants to be my disciple, you've got to hate your mother and your father and your children and your spouse and even yourself, compared to how you love and follow Jesus, right? It's really taken after this same type of oath. Jesus isn't saying we actually have to hate all of our family in order to follow him. He's saying, look, you have to love Jesus more than you follow your family. In other words, if your family is going against God, against the teachings, you have to follow God and not your family. This is the same oath that they required be taken for the emperor. And you think about that. I won't hold myself or my children dearer than I hold the emperor or his sisters. That was a big change. They had never put the family of the emperor on there before. So he obviously loved his sisters very much, and he puts them on a coin, and that's a big deal. They are the first living women to be on a Roman coin. All of these actions are taken, and people are starting to question him a little bit, especially about the place of women, because they were supposed to kind of, raise the family, and they were very important to establish virtue and that sort of thing, but they weren't supposed to take leadership roles or be involved in the government. And here he is thrusting them out into the forefront, and they're even on the coins. But the people love it, and the people love Caligula, Gaius. So Tiberius was kind of terrible, and Caligula's a nice change, right? And he finishes the temple of Augustus on his 28th birthday, Caligula's 28th birthday, and everything's going great. He seems to be a pretty decent emperor. And then he gets sick. So sick that they think he might die. And people start talking about who's going to replace him when he dies. During the time that Caligula got so sick that they thought he might die, and people are talking about him, on December 15th, AD 37, Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus was born. We know him as Nero. He was born breech, which Pliny the Elder said, is quoted as saying, that's a sign that he's going to turn out miserable, horrible, and a curse to the world. Suetonius tells us that Nero was born just as the sun rose, and as he lay on the floor waiting for his father to pick him up. That's lustration. That's him accepting that this is my child. That was part of the ritual of Roman births. And there would be this kind of nervous moment where, is the father going to accept this as his child? They laid the little baby Nero, who wasn't Nero yet, on the floor. And as they did that, the first beams of the morning sun burst through the window and touched him. And they said, this is the first great-grandchild of Augustus, and this is considered a powerful omen that the son blessed him in that way. So Helios, the god of the sun, he was connected to that his whole life, ever since his birth. And that's going to imprint on Nero. We're going to see that over and over again on his coins. And even later in his threats, he threatens to go to Rhodes, which is where the Colossus of Rhodes is, which is a giant statue of Helios. So Caligula was still sick, and during the time that he's sick, an awful lot of people start accidentally falling on swords, usually swords of the Praetorian Guard. And these include anybody who might challenge Caligula to be the emperor. So he's sick and he's paranoid. And this includes his adopted son, Tiberius Gamalius, his ex-father-in-law, Silanus, and the Praetorian prefect, Matthias' life. In June of 38, his favorite sister, Drusilla, dies. Caligula does not deal well with this death. He goes into a horrible depression where he's sick and he's depressed. He stops cutting his hair. He stops shaving. He leaves Rome for a while. He institutes a period of forced mourning across the entire empire where nobody's supposed to conduct business. He has a huge funeral for her that he does all the events for, so he is the one conducting the funeral. He then forces the Senate to give her honors, including deification. Now, we say that a lot. We talk about the emperors being deified and their families being deified. We throw that around a lot. But at this point, that's a big deal. She was the first person since Augustus to receive the honor of deification, and the first woman of the imperial family to ever receive it. Tiberius had refused to deify his mother, Livia, because he did not like her after she died. And nobody wanted to deify Tiberius because they didn't like him. In Egypt, he renamed part of their calendar. A whole month he named after his sister, Drusilla. He named it Drusilios. So a new festival was instituted in Egypt around her birthday. Safe to say, Caligula really liked his sister, and he was really sad that she died. Then he gets better, and he takes retribution on anybody who thought that he was going to die, right? And then the historical record drops out, and we don't know what happens. And when the historical record picks back up, something has gone horribly wrong for everybody, because everybody's in a lot of trouble. So bunches of people are now dead or committing suicide all over the place. And the historical sources are missing or confused during this time period. We open back up, and Agrippina and Julia are both in trouble. Both of them are now exiled. So he loves his sisters so much, he puts them on coins, he adds them to the oath. One of them dies. Something changes, we don't know what. And when we pick back up, they are in exile. She's now living on a tiny island, just like her mother, after being accused of treason in AD 39. And Caligula is just kind of randomly killing people. So things have gone south quickly. And Agrippina has now, since she's in exile, little Nero, who's 3 years old, is with his father. The guy who, the only thing we know about him is he was really mean, right? So Nero, at the age of 3, has lost his mother. She's in exile. His uncle is killing people who might challenge him to the throne. And he's with his mean father, who then dies. So now Nero is without a mother and without a father. Caligula seizes his entire estate, and he has to go live with his aunt. So he goes from being fabulously wealthy at the age of 3 or 4 to being poor and sent to live with somebody he doesn't know at all, and having everything he had stolen from him by his uncle. And then in AD 41, when he is 4 or 5, Caligula is assassinated. Not just Caligula, but Caligula and his wife and his small child are all killed when they're leaving the theater It was all very well planned. And it looks like Claudius is involved because Claudius, who becomes the emperor, leaves the theater just before all this happens. So it seems to be he was tipped off that this assassination was going to happen, and he is prepared to seize power as soon as that gap is there. And under Claudius, Agrippina and her sister are immediately brought back from exile, and Nero is restored to his mother. So his fortune, by the time he's 5 years old, has changed multiple times, and he's had all of these people killed around him that are his family members. He's learning quickly how all of these politics and how all of this very high politic kind of life works and how brutal it can all be. And the first thing they do is they go collect the body of Caligula and his wife and child, where they had just kind of thrown it in an alley after they assassinated him. They go collect the bodies and they give him it's called pietas in Latin. It's this strong family or religious duty. It's hard for us to explain it exactly, but in order to avoid being haunted by his ghost for the rest of their life, and in order to fulfill the family obligations, even though he had done horrible things to them and their family, they go give him and his family a proper burial and reestablish things right. So now Claudius has seized power, but while he was good at getting the power and becoming emperor, he is just terrible at being an emperor. He's just really bad at it. He's not good with people. He alienates all the Senate. He just can't pull the strings of power. He's always second-guessing himself. He's wishy-washy with his decisions. Whoever talks to him last, that's who's getting their way. And he's married, if you can even imagine this, to somebody even worse, to Messalina. Long story short, she's not a very good wife. Claudius, when I say she's not a good wife, I mean that she does terrible things behind his back, like getting married to somebody else while he's out of town. That's kind of a bad wife thing to do, don't you think? And so he's out of town, and she gets married to another guy. She goes through an elaborate ceremony, and she's throwing a big party for the wedding party. And somebody goes and tells Claudius, hey, as soon as you left town, your wife got married to somebody else. And he says, what? And he turns around and comes back and kills everybody involved. If you're at that party, you're going to die. So people hear that he's coming back. They all leave the party. And the guy who got married to her dies, and she dies. Everybody dies. It's very bad to be on the wrong side of Claudius. Well, after Messalina dies, she had 2 children, Britannicus and Octavia. Agrippina steps into the power. She is Claudius's niece, but she sees her chance. She divorces her husband. She's remarried at this point. So that an uncle can marry his niece, which was forbidden by law, which is a good law. Let's keep that law, right? But Claudius marries Agrippina, and something amazing happens to Claudius. Overnight, as soon as he marries Agrippina, he becomes a great emperor all of a sudden. The history books don't always say this, they don't make it clear, but they strongly suggest that Agrippina was really good at playing politics, that she was really good at pulling the strings of power, that she plays this active role and basically fixes Claudius's rule. She brings about order. She figures out how to get the Senate to be on their side, to do the things that they want the Senate to do. She even goes to the Senate and sits behind a curtain, because women weren't allowed in the Senate, and listens to the debates and pulls those strings of power. And eventually, she is even elevated to be on the same level as Claudius. So when people are coming to negotiate peace, or to talk to them, she's going to be on the same platform on a throne right next to Claudius. And this is a new thing in Roman politics. Some people really didn't like that, but they really don't have much choice. And eventually, she is given the title Augusta. So here on this coin of Claudius, you see Claudius on this side, and Agrippina Augusta. She's given the title Augustus, essentially, co-ruler. This was not a normal thing for Romans. He adopts Lucius, Domitius, Ahenobarbus, Nero, Claudius, Caesar, Drusus, Germanicus, which is just a huge name change for an 11-year-old, I tell you. But he becomes Nero at this point. And Nero is 11 years old, and he now has a stepbrother from Messalina, the murdered empress, stepbrother Britannicus, who is 7, and a stepsister, Octavia, who is 9. Nero is 11. All right. Claudius gets sick. Sounds familiar, right? Which prompts them to push Nero into manhood and sort of take on the role of potential replacement. So at the age of 15, he is pretty much forced to marry his stepsister, to allow Nero and his family to get married to the right people. So he is now forced to marry, at 15, his 13-year-old stepsister, which he doesn't like very much. And I don't think she liked it very much either. It does not turn out well for either of them. Claudius leaves for 3 days, and he puts Nero temporarily in charge to prove that he can do it, I think, to kind of show, look, he's going to take over for me when I'm ready to retire or when I die. This included presiding over court. So you can imagine you have appealed to Caesar, and you have gone to Rome, and you have waited for your case to come up, right? And 15-year-old Nero is going to decide your case after all that time. Not a great situation. But I want you to understand Nero's position at this point. At this point, he has seen a lot of death, and there's been a lot of crazy things that have happened in his family. You've got to imagine that affected his psyche. Replaced. He's trapped in the role that his mother, Agrippina, and Rome wants for him. Whether he wants to be emperor or not, he either becomes emperor or somebody's going to kill him. And he figures this out. He's realized, look, I've got to become emperor. And if anyone manages to outmaneuver Agrippina or outmaneuver him, they will both be killed. Claudius, his adopted father, helped kill somebody to become emperor. So guess what? He's extremely paranoid all the time. He thinks people are out to get him, right? And who better to be out to get you than Nero, who's in line for the throne? So throughout all of this, there's this really neat little story. And I had an artist draw these pictures from coins of these kids. But that's Nero, and that's Britannicus. And there's a story that Agrippina gives them a bird, and they play with it all day and together and try to teach it to talk. That's about the only story about Nero that we have from his childhood. And I think it's just kind of a neat little story where they just play together all day, kind of in innocence, and try to teach this bird to talk. But anyway, that's unfortunately, times of innocence are very brief for them. And later, when he gets bored of palace life and he's not emperor yet, he starts sneaking out and hanging out with gangs and trying to to get in fights and steal stuff and knock stuff over, just kind of being a rebel, typical teenager kind of stuff. And he even gets beat up sometimes. He comes back with bruises on his face and injuries. But eventually, he's going to have to reign, or he's going to be killed. And so if Claudius dies, he's going to take over. And that's kind of how things are set up. But Claudius doesn't die. And Britannicus is getting older, and that's Claudius's actual son, whereas Nero's his adopted son. And now Britannicus is almost old enough to where we could put him into rule. Maybe we don't need Nero after all. And you can kind of see the wheels starting to turn with Claudius, and some things are changing. We see him appearing on some coins, and it's almost like Claudius has decided that Britannicus is to die all of a sudden from a poison mushroom. Almost as if she planted the poison mushroom. So that's kind of supposed that she killed Claudius. And she immediately goes to Claudius's body and prepares for Nero to take power. She preps the guard, bribes them to say, Hail Nero as he comes out, and take him to the Senate. She goes and gets Seneca, who is a famous orator and a close ally of Agrippina. She had brought him back from exile, and she sets him up as Nero's tutor, and he writes a speech for Nero to give before the Senate. So Nero's off learning this speech. They pull him out of the palace, and they've paid the guard to start saying, Hail Caesar Nero. And he goes to the Senate and he delivers this promise to do away with executions without trial. And we're not going to have this reign of fear like we've had under other people. And I'm going to bring peace and order to the empire. I'm not going to give family special treatment. I'm going to be a great emperor. That's kind of the speech that he delivers to the Senate. Meanwhile, Agrippina dispatches assassins to kill every other rival to the throne. Any other real family contender in the line of Augustus, even if they are not likely to seize power, is now going to die. And Marcus Junius Silanus, the governor of Asia, he's known to be really laid back and non-ambitious. Doesn't matter. She sends off assassins to kill him because he's related to Augustus. She kills Narcissus, who was one of the Claudius's closest advisors. He advised him not to marry Agrippina. She held that against him. So as soon as he died, left. And Nero has really been handed the empire by his mother, and he realizes this. And she fully expects teenage Nero to listen to her and do what she says. And at first he does. In fact, when he comes back from the Senate, he sets the password for the day to be Optima Mater, the best mother. That's the password to get into the palace. And the most interesting evidence for what happens next over the course of the next year is not out of Tacitus or any. Later, he issues a coin where she's standing behind every good boy is his mother, right? So she's there behind him. And then before long, she's not on the same side of the coin at all. And after that, she's gone. She's not on the coinage at all. So what appears to happen is that kind of what you can expect would happen is that he's rebellious, and now he's fully in power, and he's starting to realize the power that he has. And he's been forced into all these situations his whole life, things he didn't want to do. He didn't want to marry his stepsister. He didn't want to become emperor. He didn't want to do all this stuff, right? I want to sing and dance and play the lyre, and I want to act and ride chariot. I want to do all these things that emperors aren't supposed to do. His mother wants him to be the perfect emperor. she's very good at playing politics, and so she can direct him and advise him everything he should do. And so she gets very put out every time he doesn't do exactly what she wants him to do. He's a 17-year-old boy who has unlimited power, and his mother, who's 39, who's very experienced, wants him to be a good emperor. Meanwhile, she's put two advisors over Nero that she thinks are going to be loyal to her because she's rescued them, she's saved them. Seneca is one of them, and Burrus is the other. And she felt like, look, I've got the connections, I've got the experience. I really should be emperor, but I'm a woman, so I can't be. So my son's going to be my surrogate emperor. He's going to do what I say, and I'm going to put these advisors over him that are loyal to me. Funny thing, though, Seneca and Burrus, very wise guys, then they figure out, we don't really have to be loyal to Agrippina. We really could cozy up to Nero, and he wants to do all these things that his mother doesn't want him to do. We could just advise him to go ahead and do some of those things. And they start whispering in his ear. They're not loyal to Agrippina like she hopes that they would be, and there's very little she can do about it because she's a woman. And Seneca especially thinks that he wants to be a tutor to Nero like Aristotle was to Alexander the Great. So they're indulgent, and Agrippina as a woman is out of her place whenever she tries to push her agenda. It should be noted too, Nero really was not interested in politics as much as he was in playing, we call it the lyre, but it's actually a cithara. It's larger than that. You can see it here. And it had this box on the bottom that amplified the sound. So he plays the cithara. He's very serious about it. He hires the world's best cithara player to teach him, and he practices it all the time. And she thinks this is a waste of time. Emperors aren't supposed to be playing instruments and performing and that sort of thing. He's not even allowed to perform because he's an emperor. But he's very passionate about it. He's very passionate about chariot racing. Again, that's not the place for emperors. They're not supposed to be racing chariots. So none of these things are appropriate for the emperor, but they're all the things that he's interested in. And then he starts to think, how will I be remembered? What do I want my legacy to be? And he wants it to be about peace. And you see this on a whole bunch of his coins. So this is young, independent, pretty good looking and athletic Nero. And you see this on his coins at this time. He's pretty athletic looking. He's not real heavy yet. And he always struggles with weight, it looks like, because, he's very indulgent and everything. But on a bunch of his coins, he starts putting Janus. Now, I mentioned this a couple of nights ago. The temple of Janus was the god who looks both ways. He has two faces. And if the doors to his temple are open, then the empire is at war. If they're closed, the empire is at peace. He wants to issue the Pax Romana. He wants to issue a period of peace across the whole empire. And he issues these coins where he puts this laurel right here in front of the doors so they can't be opened. He's saying there's going to be a lasting peace. That's going to be my legacy. And that he's really almost like a hippie. He's like, let's make love, not war. That's what he's all about. He's like, I like art and theater and all these things. I don't want war. He never visits the soldiers, not one time. And eventually, the final break between him and his mother comes from a very expected source. Another woman, right? Not just any other woman, but Acta, who is a slave girl from Asia. Pretty much the worst possible person he could choose if you're Nero's mother. She was also older than Nero. Nero always likes older women. He always chooses, when he gets to choose a mate, he's always choosing older women who are like his mother, who are dominant. This is a psychological thing. And he was never in love or even liked Octavia, his child wife, who's younger than him. He always liked older women, and he tried to keep his affair from his mother, but his mother has spies all over the place, and she learns of it, and she flies into a rage. And she demands that he get rid of her. I made you an emperor, she said. She threatens him as if she could take it back now and seize power herself. And Nero immediately calls her bluff, and he says, I'm going to abdicate the throne. I'm going to step down. I don't want to be emperor. And I'm going to move with Acta. I'm going to divorce my wife and move with Acta. We're going to move to Rhodes, where I'm going to act. So this is Nero's great plan. And he ties himself to Helios. He really views himself, I think, as the embodiment of Helios, the god of the sun, and he wants to act in Greece. That's what he really wants to do and what he's passionate about. Further evidence of the strained relationship, his mother had been helping him with foreign affairs, and then Parthia sends an envoy to him to try to keep the peace, and Agrippina kind of comes to that meeting, and Nero gets up really quick and stops her and says, you leave, you're not in this meeting. And it's very public retribution, or rebuke of his mother, where he's seizing the power himself. And so she sees that the relationship is broken, and she starts to try to mend fences, but it's too late. And he does try to reach out to her. I think Nero feels bad. He starts sending her expensive gifts. She's insulted by the gifts and says things like, well, that's not nearly what you owe me. I gave you the entire empire, and you sent me a nice dress and some expensive jewelry. So she's insulted by all the gifts. This time, while all this is playing out with his mother, another bad thing happens, and that's Britannicus dies really suddenly. He is at dinner with Nero and Octavia, and he falls down at the table and starts convulsing, and they carry him into another room, and they don't seem really concerned about it. Depending on who you listen to, that's because Nero poisoned him, or because they just thought he was trying to have, or he was having an epileptic fit. He did have epilepsy, and there were a lot of people that would have been worried if Britannicus came to power, because they had aided in killing his mother, Messalina. But I don't think that Nero was one of them. I don't think Nero worried about Britannicus at this point. And I also don't think Agrippina, who was known to kill people, I don't think she would have wanted to kill him, because she viewed him as her adopted son as a viable alternative to Nero. If she can pull the strings of, if she's going to fall out with Nero, if she can pull the strings of power around and assassinate Nero, then maybe Britannicus would be another chance for her to seize power. So I don't believe Agrippina would have wanted him dead. She can see her star fading, and that would be one of her only ways out. I think he died by tetanoid epilepsy, but there were certainly rumors that Nero killed him. I don't think he did. And the reason I don't think that is it's only reported by these people that don't like him. They reported that he poisoned him. There's no indication. Nero hasn't killed anybody up to this point. And Nero, I really think he's like a big kind of hippie kind of guy. He really wants to follow that let's just all get along and do art, and let's not have a whole bunch of bloodshed. In fact, side of blood, he is squeamish of blood. He never once visits the soldiers in the field. For all those reasons, I don't think he killed Britannicus. I think that's a myth. And I think he died just from natural causes. But it's about this time that he kicks Agrippina out of the palace and removes her from all court politics. And she suddenly finds herself alone. He sends her to another palace alone, where she is removed from all court politics, and nobody wants to talk to her. Nobody wants to come and be associated with Agrippina. So all of her previous friends, they realize that Nero is now in charge, and he's fully had a break with his mother. And it's at this point that Tacitus gives her this elaborate, long speech that she gives in this empty palace to nobody. But it gives a good glimpse of how bad Roman history is. All right, we're going to take another short break. Allow me to get a quick drink and allow you to use the restroom if you need to. And then we'll be back in 10 minutes. So thank you. All right, we're back. Welcome back. Everything's good? Oh, clap. Yeah, there we go. It wakes everybody up and gets us started again. I will say that tomorrow we're going to clean coins, and you should come back and do that because it is a ton of fun. And you can actually find good stuff. Like Matt was just saying, what if somebody found a Nero coin? If you find a Nero coin, then you have to sell it to me at half price. But the best coin, I've cleaned a whole bunch of coins. The best coin I personally have ever found was an extremely rare Vitellius, who was only emperor for a couple of months after Nero died. And that coin's worth $900,000, something like that. I bought it for significantly less than that because it was just a dirty coin. You couldn't tell what it was. So it is possible to find really, really good stuff. Although usually what you find are coins of Constantine because they are the most prolific coins of the Roman Empire. They can still be worth a good bit, but that's last time I did this at Post the Pulpit. We had a couple of people find what's called camp gates, which are the actual camp gates. They're like the defenses for the camps when you go and lay siege to a place. And those are worth $50, $60 each. So those are pretty nice coins. They can be worth more if they're in really good condition. So you might find something really cool. And it's a lot of fun to clean up an old coin and identify it. So come and do that tomorrow morning at 10 a.m. I'll give you some instructions and then turn you loose with a toothbrush and some baking soda, and you'll be off to the races. Back to Nero. So his mother's she's not in exile, but she's pushed off to a palace alone. She's removed from court politics. A little while later, some of Nero's friends decide to try to get rid of her, and they plot accusing her of wanting to kill Nero. And they wait until Nero is drunk, and they try to convince him that his mother's going to kill him. And he panics and decides to try to kill her without a trial. But then one of his advisors says, wait a minute. You don't even know that she really wants to kill you. Let's question her. She delivers such an outraged and adamant denial that she carries the day. And for a while, they're kind of reconciled. And it looks like things are going to be okay between AD 55 and AD 59. Not much happens. Agrippina must be staying out of the way because she's just removed from the record. There's nothing about her. Nero is young and independent, and he's gaining in popularity. One way that he does that, he has competent advisors. So Burrus and Seneca, they turn out to be pretty good advisors. They give him good advice. And anytime his popularity starts to wane, they give him the advice to pay off everybody. He does things like give a year's salary, 400 sesterces, to every single Roman citizen. So he's going to give them a whole bunch of money. That makes him very popular. Somehow if the government suddenly gives you money, you become popular, right? That's how that works. Then he kept tighter controls over tax collectors, and he ends the abuses of that. He keeps peace at all costs. He does not want to go to war. And he promotes art and Greek ideas, philosophy, plays, music, any kind of athletics, physical prowess, those kinds of things. And there are several coins, like I said, with the Temple of Janus on them. And that's a new motif. We haven't seen that before on coinage. He's showing that the Pax Romana is going to stay in place. And that really allows the Apostle Paul to travel fairly freely throughout the Roman Empire as a Roman citizen. And it brings about a decent order and improved infrastructure. Instead of fighting wars and expensively maintaining these faraway territories, he puts that money into infrastructure. Seneca encourages Nero to follow the advice of do unto others as you would the gods do unto you. That's advice that Seneca gives him, leading some people to believe that Seneca has been converted to Christianity. It's not known. if that's true, but that is some rather Christian advice to give to Nero. Nero follows this advice, and he's learned that if he wants to achieve more, he needs the love of the people. He doesn't need to upset people. So he rarely uses his power to the limit. He tries to be magnanimous and lenient whenever possible. It's at this point that in his rule, he runs into another older, ambitious, beautiful woman, and that's Poppaea. She's on the screen. He starts putting her on coins. He really likes Poppaea, but she's married to Otho. Otho, any other emperor would have killed Otho and taken Poppaea. But Nero appoints him to governor of a faraway province and sends him off, keeps Poppaea there, and he's still married, but he's running around with Poppaea. And in AD 59, she accuses him of not being master of himself, saying he's still the ward of his mother. Now, it's not clear what leads to Nero's decision to kill his mother, Agrippina. Up to this point, he really hasn't killed anybody. If you don't think, and I don't think, that he killed Britannicus, then he hasn't killed anybody. But he's going to pursue killing his mother at this point. And he does so in the most dramatic way you can possibly think of. He goes to a theatrical performance. And this performance, there's a ship that's constructed, and it sails out, and it breaks apart. It's constructed in such a way as to the ship breaks apart, and a bunch of animals fall off of it, and then the ship comes back together and sails off. And he says, aha, I want to do that. That's how I want to kill my mother. Okay. So he calls in the commander of his navy, and he says, I want to kill my mother, and I want to do it just like this in this play I saw. I want you to design me a ship that's going to come apart, and she's going to be on a couch, and she's going to fall into the water and die. That's how I want my mother to die. And he says, okay, sure. So he builds this ship. It takes time. Probably Agrippina hears rumor of this at some point, but doesn't believe it because it's a really dumb way to try to kill somebody, right? And nevertheless, he has this ship constructed. He plots it for months, and he decides to take action at the festival of Minerva outside of Rome, where he has a villa on the sea, and his mother has another villa down the seashore with an easy sailing distance. So he invites her to his feast, and she accepts. And he welcomes her with open arms, personally gives her the seat of honor, talks with her for hours all night, listens to her advice and her opinions, and embraces her as she's leaving and boarding the ship that's going to take her to her death. So she's with her lady-in-waiting. She's reclining on a bench that's under a roofed area that is rigged. And this, her bodyguard stands nearby. So the roof has weighted lead on it, and it's supposed to collapse. So when they get far enough out to sea, some kind of signal is given, and they pull it, and that thing starts to collapse, and the bodyguard sees it and dives in front of it and shields her, and he dies. He gets crushed by it. She gets injured, and her lady-in-waiting gets away. So both of them get off. The couch kind of cushions it, and so that didn't kill her, and that didn't fall into the water like it was supposed to. She comes out of the rubble of this thing, and all kinds of crazy things are happening. There's a whole bunch of people who seem to be trying to tear the ship apart. And there's other people who are evidently not in on it, who are trying to pull the ship back together. And throughout this, it's not clear who gives the signal, but her lady-in-waiting says, "Save me, I'm the empress. I'm Agrippina." And a couple guys come over and beat her to death with some oars. And Agrippina sees it. And she's like, aha, I'm finished, right? She dives into the water. And she swims, even though she's injured, she swims to a fishing boat that rescues her and takes her to shore. And other people on the shore help her get back to her villa. So she survives the assassination attempt. But she has figured out that her son's trying to kill her, right? So at some point, word gets back to Nero that his mother is dead because they think they've killed her in the dark and the confusion of everything. Meanwhile, Agrippina is being cared for, and she's figured out what's happened, and she doesn't know the best way to react. So she figures out, I'm going to take my most trusted servant and give him precise instructions. I want you to run to the emperor's house and tell him that I had a lucky escape from an accidental shipwreck. Make it seem that I don't know what's going on, but I'm okay, but I'm injured and I'm resting and recovering. Don't come see me. I'm fine. I'll see you soon, my dear son. So she sends him off to the palace. Well, when he gets there, Nero panics, right? He summons Burrus and Seneca, and he says, what am I supposed to do? I tried to kill my mother, and she's not dead, and now she's probably figured it out, and what am I supposed to do, right? And evidently, Seneca and Burrus didn't know about this plot up to this point, but they advise him to strike again before she can marshal support and manage to kill him and start a civil war. So he says, okay, and he tries to get his Praetorian Guard to go kill her. The Praetorian Guard says, no, we're not going to kill a member of the royal family who's the daughter of Germanicus. None of us would agree to do that. So Nero turns back to his naval captain who agrees to do it. He goes, he surrounds the house. There's all these people there celebrating her being saved from the shipwreck. They scatter them when they break down the door. They go in to her room, and she's not even convinced at that point that they're going to kill her. One of them comes and strikes her, and then at that point she is reported to have said, strike here in my womb that birthed this horrible monster Nero, and they kill her. So the real question in all of this is, why did Nero all of a sudden turn into someone who would kill his own mother when he hasn't killed anybody up until this point? I think he was pushed by Poppaea, and he wanted to be free from his mother's watchful eye. He wanted to be free to do what he wanted to do. He felt held back by her. And once he went down that road, there was no going back. And Nero sends a message to the Senate through Seneca that says that she killed herself after sending an assassin to kill Nero, and that plot failed. And so he forced her to kill herself, and it lists all of her supposed crimes up to this point. The Senate, being such a good check of power, vote to erect twin gold statues of Nero and Minerva and issue time of celebration and thanksgiving for the emperor's safety. So Nero gets away with killing his own mother. And then suddenly, now that she's not watching him all the time, he becomes a rock star, literally. Like he's going to go on tour and play the instrument and the cithara and act and go be in the Olympic Games. And he's going to do all these things that she was always holding him back from doing. And Tacitus makes the point of saying he suddenly is in the chariot races and he's singing in a concert in the park. And this is reprehensible behavior for an emperor, and he shouldn't do any of these things. And he's going to bring disaster upon the empire. He said, Rome's great leaders had not won all these famous victories of the past by prancing around on a public stage, but by directing their armies in battle. So in AD 59, he holds games to celebrate the shaving of his beard. It's a weird thing to celebrate, but that's what he did. In 60 AD, he has even more elaborate games featuring music and poetry and athletics. Now, he doesn't take part in them, but they award him a whole bunch of prizes anyway. They give him some of the prizes. And these games were such a success and the people liked them so much that he says, well, every 5 years, just like the Olympics are every 4, we're going to have these games. And he does all of this at his own expense. He issues a huge public bath. He makes a public bath and gymnasium that was completed in 2 years. Free admission to everybody and complimentary body oil for everybody who goes to it. In AD 63, it was struck by lightning and burned down, but he did do that, and it was very popular. He finally started doing public performances, and he tried to stick to the rules, but he wanted to win all the ribbons, right? He wanted to win all the laurels. And one time he drops a prop, and he's worried that the judges are going to mark him down. But of course, they award him the top prize anyway. Burrus dies, and Seneca decides things are getting out of hand. I want to retire. So Seneca leaves. So he's now lost his 2 best advisors, and Poppaea and a man who's named Tigellinus, he becomes his advisor, and he builds an apparatus of terror. Tigellinus advises Nero to carry out executions without trial. One of his early victims is Octavia, his wife. He divorces her and exiles her, and then 12 days later, he marries Poppaea. They plot against Octavia. They accuse her of adultery. They torture her slaves to try to get confessions from them, which they didn't do because she probably wasn't guilty. The mob even rises up twice to defend Octavia because they loved her because she was from Caesar, from Augustus. And eventually they put down these mobs. And you remember Nero was concerned at the people. He always wanted the love of the people. So what happened to this benevolent ruler? Well, up to this point now, he's got 4 confirmed killings in 8 years of rule, which is far, far better than any of his predecessors. Eventually, he has a daughter with Poppaea. This is celebrated all over the empire. And then he takes the final decisive steps to a real stage career. He really wants to be a rock star. So he decides to go on a great tour. And he's going to start in Naples. He's going to go through all of Greece and do this tour. He does this, but he's at some point struck with a mysterious illness. He comes back to Rome. He hears about a plot against him, and he puts the plot down. And then it's at this point that's the real turning point in Nero's reign. Up to this point, there have been a couple of uprisings over the Octavia murder, but really he's kept everything in check, and he's still very popular. But during this tour, there's a performance that he gives, and during the performance, there's an earthquake. And he just keeps performing, and everybody's too scared to leave a performance by him. So once he's done, everybody leaves, and soon after everybody's out of the arena, it collapses from the earthquake or from the aftershocks. Everybody says this is a warning from the gods that you shouldn't be doing this. He says, no, it's not a warning from the gods. I brought down the house. He said, nobody was hurt, and I'm the final performance at this because the gods thought that my performance was so great that no other performance could go on after mine. Delusional would be a word for him. And it's at this point he comes back to Rome, and he's just outside of Rome, about 35 miles away, when disaster strikes. The Great Fire in Rome is the final turning point in Nero's reign. It's a disaster on a tremendous scale, and it's one that he never recovers from fully. Nero's at his seaside resort 35 miles from Rome, but the fire spreads rapidly through the cook shops, through the neighborhoods, and it quickly rages out of control. Someone gets a message to Nero. He rushes to Rome, where he immediately takes action. He rides to Rome. He sets up organizing the firefighting shelter. He releases all of his soldiers to become firefighters, even his personal bodyguard. He even personally takes an active role in trying to put down the fire. He opens up shelter and food. He opens up all public buildings, all temples, for shelter for people to sleep who have lost their homes. He organizes demolition teams to try to make fire breaks, but all of that is not enough. They don't have enough. They have about 7,000 firefighters, but that's not enough. And it rages beyond their control. It is the largest fire in all of antiquity. Even the London fire of 1666 burned only half as long, and that a fire like this happens anywhere on earth, and certainly in Europe. Some people blame Nero. They say, he fiddled while Rome burned, right? He played and talked about the burning of Troy. That's definitely not true. That's not what he was doing. But the way that rumor got started is he was off doing things emperors shouldn't do, right? He was performing. He was doing things that emperors shouldn't do. They should be leading armies and conquering territories, and he's out here doing all this art. He's brought the wrath of the gods upon us. And it's without a doubt that's how that was viewed by almost everybody. Everybody's looking at him as this ruler who's killed his mother, killed his wife. He's out there doing performances, and he has angered the gods and brought them down upon us. Nero threw himself into trying to fix his reputation. He sets up more fire brigades. He starts up new building standards that include fire breaks, and you could only build so high, and all sorts of rules. He starts making continual burning sacrifices to the gods and goddesses of Rome. He's desperately searching around for someone else to blame, and he finds the people to blame, and that's the Christians. Now, given in his history of the decline and fall of the Roman Empire, he makes the point that while Judaism was a people, they were a nation, Christians were a sect, right? These are people who have chosen to turn their back on normal life and join this strange group. In addition, they talk about a king, and they talk about the world ending in fire, right? They're a pretty good target. Let's blame the Christians for this great fire. In that, we can really read Romans 8 with different eyes, can't we? I mean, we can go back and look at Romans 8 and think about how we are super conquerors. We are more than conquerors, and it kind of puts different eyes on all of that in Romans. But he persecutes the Christians. We only have one source that tells us that, and no Christian sources at all talk about it. And that's clear by what happens to Nero. But it's through this that we get these mythologies that you sometimes hear about Paul and Peter being killed or being martyred. Now, I think there's pretty good evidence that both Paul and Peter were martyred, particularly better evidence about Paul than there is Peter. But there is silence in the scripture about it. Clement, who's an early Christian writer, does mention that Paul was a martyr. But it's not till you get to the 4th century that you get this story about Peter and Paul being killed on the same day, and because Paul was a Roman citizen, he's going to be beheaded, and Peter is going to be crucified. And, because the Romans are such nice guys, they're taking them both out on the same day, and they're going to split up. Paul's going to go over here and get his head cut off, and Peter's going to go over here and get crucified, and they let them hug and talk a few minutes, and then Paul goes and gets his head chopped off, and Peter goes and requests to be crucified upside down. Now, I'm sure you've heard people say, and Peter was crucified upside down. I just think that's garbage. There's no evidence for that at all. And I do not think that the Romans took requests at executions. I don't think the Romans were sitting there going, Peter's like, I'm not worthy to be crucified like Christ. Please crucify me upside down. They're like, okay, we'll crucify. No, they're not taking requests. They're executing people. So I just don't think that's good history, or there's any evidence for that whatsoever. Nero tries to rebuild his reputation, and one of the things he does is he clears off a rather large section of Rome that was burned and decides to build his golden palace. So here's the quote from Tacitus. This is the only evidence we have about him persecuting Christians. He said he inflicted the most exquisite tortures on those men who, under the vulgar appellation of Christians, were already branded with deserved infamy. That's the only evidence we have that he persecuted Christians. I think certainly he did persecute Christians, but it was very limited. He builds this golden palace. Later, people find this underground and they lower artists down who are constructing the Vatican, and they built this room in the Vatican to look like Nero's golden palace. But I really think that the final straw for Nero was he identified himself as a god, as Helios, as the Colossus of Rhodes, right? Which is this giant statue of Helios that had fallen, and he was fascinated with it. He had a picture of it on his helmet or on his armor, and he pictures himself on many of his coins as Helios with the radiant crown. And he decides he's going to build a giant statue of himself in the middle of Rome. So he's already fairly unpopular at this point, and then he decides to erect a 103-foot tall naked statue of himself. I put clothes on it for you. I actually had my daughter put clothes on it for you. As Helios, he successfully builds this. It stands until the Middle Ages. In fact, the Colosseum is named the Colosseum because it stands right next to where the Colossus of Nero was. It's said at one time to be moved by 24 elephants, and a couple of different emperors chopped the head off and put their head on this Colossus of Nero. But it was later moved to make room for the Temple of Venus and Roma. But for many, I believe, this is the final straw. And we don't know exactly what happened, but we can see this Colossus of Nero. This is the Colossus of Rhodes. I have that coin up here. This is the Nero as Helios. You see it when he was a young man. You see it when he's older. This is where the Colossus stood. And this is, of course, before the Colosseum was there, but this is the center of that area. You can see it again on this aerial photograph, but it was destroyed by Mussolini. It was bulldozed, but the platform, the foundation of it is still there. You can also see it on some coins. You can see the Colossus of Nero, which was next to the Colosseum. Alone, his guard's gone, all of his servants are gone, he's alone in the palace. And he figures out, something's up. And he makes a run for it. He ends up in a villa outside the city with just a few servants to help him. The Praetorian Guard are coming for him. The Senate has decided to bring him back and put him on trial. And he's going to have to be forced to be executed in a very torturous way. So he's scared. He hears the guard coming for him, and he realizes the best way out for him is to commit suicide, but he's scared of doing it. So he asks one of his servants to commit suicide first so he can see what that looks like, which happens. And then he ends up uttering his final words were reported to be, "What an artist dies with me." And then he kills himself as the guards get there. I think Nero, I feel bad for him in a lot of ways. I don't think he is as bad as his reputation is up until a point. But at some point, absolute power and his desire to do what he wanted to do corrupted him, and he ends up killing his mother. He probably persecuted Christians. But I don't think every evil thing that's ever been reported about him is true. Some of them seem fairly ridiculous. And I kind of feel sorry for him. I feel like he was trapped in a situation that almost anybody would have not acted appropriately. But I think the big point is that we can see from his coinage how he wanted to be remembered as this great artist, but instead he's remembered for some of the violent and horrible acts that he committed. All right. Thank you all for your time. I really appreciate it.